I think at the end of the day, we're missing the point. It's, asking ourselves, what is the life that I want? And it may not be college. It could be trade school. It could be, going and apprenticing or getting a mentorship or something like that. It could be starting your own business. Whatever it is, I think people just need to figure out what's right for them and then pursue that mercilessly.
That is Ryan Mitchell this week on the Do It For Yourself podcast. Hey everybody, how's it going? I just have a quick question for you that I want to start off with, and I want you to think about this for a second. Have you ever lost your job and you were thinking about how am I going to pay for my bills? How am I going to cover my cost of living, etc., etc.? Well, that is exactly what happened to this week's podcast guest, Ryan Mitchell, and it happened right during the heat of the financial crisis in 2008. And Ryan decided that he was going to make a change, but he was going to make a significant change. And so that is what we discussed this week on the podcast. It's my podcast, and my name is Ian, and this is the Do It For Yourself podcast, and I am your host, your guide here on this little journey that we are going to take through Ryan's story. And when Ryan lost his job, he sat down and he took a look at the numbers, and he realized that if he could cut his cost of living down significantly, he would be able to save some money, but he would also not have to have this worry ever again. And this was about the time that Ryan discovered and started researching tiny houses. Yes, that is correct. Tiny houses. I am so excited to bring you this interview with Ryan because it is unlike any guest that I have had thus far on the podcast. You see, I've had people who have done some amazing things as far as weight loss, starting a business, triathlon journeys, going to Kona multiple times, but I have yet to have someone who is doing it for themselves quite like this. And so as soon as Ryan reached out to me, I knew that this was someone that I needed to have on the podcast. And we take a deep dive and we just weave through this amazing story of how Ryan went from losing his job and really kind of being in a dark place because he wasn't sure how he was going to cover his bills, to now being in a position of not only living in a tiny house that he built with his own two hands, but now he's had book deals and companies that he's built and sold, and now he has land. It's an amazing story, and I am going to let Ryan tell the rest of it. So without further ado, here is my interview with Ryan Mitchell. So let's get rolling. This evening, I am joined by Ryan Mitchell, and I'm going to let Ryan do his introduction here. But just before we get started and get into Ryan's introduction, Ryan reached out to me via email, and as soon as I read through his email, I knew that I wanted to get him on the show because he is doing something for himself, and it is something way different than I have had in the past on this show. I mean, I've had people who've started their own business. I've had people who've gone through weight loss journeys. I've had people who have, done some amazing things in triathlon. But after reading the short synopsis that Ryan gave me on what he is doing, I knew I had to get him on the show. So Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. And why don't you give us a brief introduction about how you are doing it for yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and about 7 years ago, I had basically the company that I was working for kind of my first adult job went under, and this was in the recession. So this story isn't too unique to me in that regard. But what was a little different from other people is what I decided to do about it. At that point, I was just at the beginning of my career, and I said that I never wanted to be in that position again. So I looked at my budget, and I noticed that about half my income was going towards housing, which included, rent and utilities and insurance and things like that. And I said, crazy question. What if I was able to just eliminate that line item? I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't know if it was even possible, but I I said if I could, the wins would be huge, and then I could basically recapture half my income. So if I was ever in that position again, where I was in a recession or a job loss or I had to move or whatever life threw at me, I would be much better off. And that led me to, after a lot of thinking and research, to tiny houses. And tiny houses, if you don't know, are small, little structures, obviously, and they typically go from 150 to 400 square feet for 1 to 2 people. For families, a little bit bigger. But I decided that I was going to build a tiny house for myself, and that started me on a journey where I was able to leave my 9 to 5 corporate job. I started a website around tiny houses to teach people how to build them and live in them and kind of live more simply. That website's thetinylife.com, where we focus on tiny houses, tiny living, simple living, that kind of thing. And that's kind of the story. I've been living in my tiny house for over 5 years now, completely off the grid, off solar power. And with it, I've been able to start companies and travel the world.
So my first question is, your tiny house is portable. You can move it to wherever you want to go. It's almost like an RV or a trailer.
Yeah, so technically it is portable. It's built on a flatbed utility trailer. I've moved it once, but it's not something I enjoy. Like I want to do full time moving because it is a large, heavy structure to be towing. But what it does afford me is flexibility. So, I built it in one location, and I decided I was going to move to a different location to actually live in it. If I ever decided I wanted to live in a different part of the country, I could, hook up my house and go in a matter of a day or so if I really needed to. So kind of how it differs from a camper and RV, like a lot of people, you know, liken it to, like you did. It's basically built like a traditional home. So it has all the features of a home. It's built with traditional materials using traditional techniques and, kind of performs in the way that a traditional home would. Whereas campers and RVs are primarily for seasonal use. So they're not so great in the winter when it's really cold out, where my house handles that just fine.
Okay, so you have a fully functional house. You have a full shower. You have a toilet. You have all of those things, and when you are there, you don't have to like hook up to water like you would if you went to a campground, for example.
So the way that my house is I am connected to the city water, but it's just like you would hook up at a campground or something like that. It's actually, I literally went to the RV store and bought the parts off the shelf that they use to do the connections and everything. So it's mostly self-contained, but it does require, a power input and a water input.
And what about your like your sewage and your waste and all of that? Where does that drain to a tank or does that drain straight into like a main city system or a septic tank?
Yeah. So tiny house, you can do it in a whole bunch of different ways. You can do a very traditional, like flush toilet down the sewer and it gets taken off to places that you don't have to worry about. But what a lot of people in tiny houses opt to do is what's called a composting toilet, which is just a fancy word for a bucket with sawdust, basically. Basically use that with a fancy box around it with a nice comfy seat, and that's kind of how I handle, the bathroom situation in my tiny house. But my house is already plumbed to accept like a traditional toilet. should I ever decide to go that way.
All right. I mean, it's, I'm just
It's
like
different.
thinking of question after question after question already, but I do want to go back a little bit, and kind of talk about, where you were, coming out of college,
Hmm.
and going into that first job. So you were in college and you graduated. What was your degree and what did you study?
Yeah, so my undergraduate was psychology, and then my graduate degree was in human resources, which was the field I was in when I kind of, this all started for me.
And would you say that when you got that first job coming out of college, that that was your dream job and you could see yourself, staying at that company for an extended period of time?
I mean, I wouldn't go as far as saying dream job, but I would definitely say like there was a path for me there, right? It was something that I was interested in. It was in an area that I wanted to pursue. My degree matched that. It earned me good money, and I enjoyed doing it. So it kind of checked a lot of the boxes for me. And up until that point, I kind of said to myself like, all right, this is the path that you're supposed to go, right? You're supposed to go to high school, do pretty well, get good SAT scores so you can get into a college. You go to college so you either get a job or you go on a master's program, things like that, and then you get your job, and then you get married, two kids, and a house on a picket fence, and all that kind of stuff. And I think the whole experience kind of woke me up to the fact that you know that maybe that is a pathway, but it maybe isn't the pathway for me. Maybe it's not the pathway for you. And I think a lot of us we kind of assume that general life trajectory in most cases, and we never really stop and say, what is right for me? What do I want? And what is possible for my future? And I think the when the recession hit and the company closed, that was kind of the shock to the system that woke me up to realize that, hey, maybe I need to start asking these bigger questions.
And did you see this coming at all? I mean, was there any talk of it? Was it, you know, a month of things going on that led to this?
Yeah, it
Or
was totally
was it,
blindsided.
yeah, yeah. So it
Oh,
was,
sorry.
you came in one day. No, that's all right. That's all right. You came in one day and they were like, "Hey, we're going to have to close this company."
Yeah, it was a pretty big shock. I remember the owner of the company came in and just kind of announced to the whole floor, "Hey, we're closing the company today. You're all out of a job, basically." And I just remember me and my coworkers in like this stunned silence as we found cardboard boxes and loaded the contents of our desk into them, and it was just a really surreal thing that really blindsided me at the time.
Yeah, so can you talk to me a little bit more like about that? Like, I know at the time you were just out of college, so you were relatively young. You didn't necessarily have a family that you had to provide for, but you still had housing that you had to provide for. You still had, bills that needed to be covered. You still probably had some student loans, I'm assuming. So what was going on in your head, as you were packing up your things and that night and some of the following days?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was a pretty big eye opener for me because, for all those reasons you just iterated, is I had bills just like everyone else does. I had student loans. This was only 6 months after me graduating from my master's program. And in fact, the week before, I had gotten a glowing employee performance review from my boss. So like I, I think at that time, what I was in my mind, I was saying, people who are smart, educated, that work hard, do a good job, and perform, to the standards that their employer set, have job security. And life decided a very different path for me, and that was something that kind of like I just had to come to terms with that because it was kind of this bill of goods sold, this lifestyle that was sold to me when I was growing up. It was something that my parents experienced, their parents experienced. You know, their generations had this age of job security that, I think as I'm a millennial, we just aren't seeing anymore. And, we kind of have to come to grips with this new reality. And I think that was my moment to say, like, all right, things are changing. What am I going to do about it?
So, and this is just as soon as you started talking about your parents and grandparents, I immediately thought of an experience that I had when I was in high school. I was never one for school.
Hmm.
Like I hated it, and I couldn't stand taking pointless classes. So like in your senior year, you're required to take a math class. I don't even think we were required to take a math class. I think we were required to take some kind of a history class. And I want to say like an English class for your
Hmm.
senior year of high school. Like that's what we were required to do. And then everything else you could just fill in with electives. Well, I had taken all the electives that had appealed to me. Like there was nothing else that appealed to me. So I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't really know what I want to do, but I have a pretty decent job. Why don't I apply for this work release program and, go to school, fulfill the requirements that I have to fulfill to graduate, and then go to work for the rest of the day? And the kicker was we would get a grade for work. Like
Right.
our bosses would submit a review to the school and then we would be graded according to that. So I'm like, man, this is great. Like I don't have to go to school and do these classes that I don't want to. Well, when my grandparents caught wind that I was going to leave school and go to work, they were like, what are you doing? You're never going to get into college. You can't do that. You have to finish school like everybody else. They were going on and on. They were, I mean, talk about blindsided. I thought my poor grandmother was going to have a heart attack at the time. And long story short, I ended up going to Westchester University. I graduated with a degree in health and phys ed, just like everybody else. I got into the school that I wanted to go to, and nobody knew any different. Like they didn't look at me any different because my senior year I left and decided to go to school. So it is funny how the older generations, like our parents and grandparents, they have this this thought, this idea so ingrained that this is what you have to do.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it certainly was true for their generation and, our parents and our grandparents' generations. Education was the key to, a good life, to better income. In my grandparents' generation, a high school diploma got you really far. In my parents' generation, a college degree got you really far. And now, a master's degree is kind of a dime a dozen, unfortunately. Uh, but I think at the end of the day, we're missing the point. It's, asking ourselves, what is the life that I want? And it may not be college. It could be trade school. It could be, going and apprenticing or getting a mentorship or something like that. It could be starting your own business. Whatever it is, I think people just need to figure out what's right for them and then pursue that mercilessly.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you on that one. I do have one more question about, this point in time when the company closed. Do you think, or, what was, in your opinion, your darkest point
Mm.
after the company had closed?
Yeah, I think it was that moment in the parking lot afterwards. We were kind of like all just standing out there because the owner of the company kind of came in like mid afternoon, kind of towards the end of the day, and made this announcement. So there was we were basically done with work at that point, obviously, earlier than we were normal. So we had kind of put our stuff in our cars and we're just talking in the parking lot. And I just remember me and a couple of the other my coworkers that were pretty close, just kind of going around and just like saying out loud in kind of this shocked state of like, how am I going to tell my wife? How how am I going to pay the bills? Like, what about my kids? I didn't have all those things for the most part. I wasn't married, I didn't have kids, I didn't have a mortgage at the time. But, it was all these worries that were just getting kind of spouted out. And then it kind of hit home that this was the bleeding edge of the recession. And we were all like really concerned that there might not be a job for a while to get. And I was really fortunate to be hired a couple months later uh, after, that thing. And I ended up in a really great job that kind of paved my way into giving me time and breathing room to start pursuing the tiny house thing. So I think that parking lot was the the kind of the kicker for me.
Yeah, I can't even imagine standing around in a parking lot with, a bunch of other employees that you've worked with for half a year already now. You've built relationships with these people, and, you have these extreme worries of, oh man, how am I going to put food on the table next week, let alone cover my electric bill that's going to be coming out of my account that's due, at the end of the month. I can't even imagine what that must have felt like.
Yeah, and I think that was the thing that really kind of woke me up was like, for the most part, the people I worked with, they did a really good job, and it was a recruitment firm, so it was very performance based. So, there was numbers, there were stats on everything that we did, and it was very clear, like who performed and who didn't. And in fact, if you didn't perform, you got fired. So, I knew basically the people standing around me were doing a really good job and performing and bringing in money for the company way above their salaries. And, for us to be grappling with these kind of scary questions of like, how do you feed your children when you've done a good job is something that just like really hit home for me. And I kind of saw that future of like, what if that was me in 10 years, married with kids and a mortgage, and I didn't want that future. And that's what led me to go down the tiny house path.
So I want to know how you first discovered even the idea of a tiny house, because I would have to imagine at the time that you discovered it, there was no show on HGTV about these people who are living in tiny houses. So, where did you first hear about this, and, how did you learn about it and kind of even become interested in it?
Yeah. So like I said, I kind of sat down with my budget and noticed that about half my income was going towards housing. And I, I just knew if I could eliminate that line item, the wins would be huge for me. So at that point, I didn't know how I was actually going to do it, right? Because, well, if people just didn't have to pay for housing, they would just do that instead of pay for housing. So I had to kind of be a little bit creative. And tiny houses were so new at that point. I mean, they weren't even really a thing. And all I really had was there was I found a picture of a guy who had built up like one of the first tiny houses that kind of in its native form, and we later became friends. His name's Jay Schaefer, but there was no details. There was no specs, there was no instructions, there was no plans, there wasn't websites or even anyone really talking about it on the website. I just had this one photo of this little house, and I was able to kind of take that concept and I just ran with it. I was like, okay, I like the look of this, I like the functionality of this. And eventually I was able to befriend Jay. I got to tour his house, and then I could see it like in real life. And then I started building, and that's kind of how it started.
So, where did you start, like with materials, with the plan, with the construction? I mean, without like hard evidence, not even evidence, but without like a book or a blueprint or anything to go off of, how did you even start? Who did you contact? I mean, like, how did you get this going?
Yeah. So I basically had the concept, I drew a floor plan basically and kind of figured some stuff out. And from there, I just used traditional home building books. So, how to frame your house, how to do electrical, how to plumb, how to do all these things. And I kind of had to figure it out from there. And it took me a long time. It took me about a year and a half, nights and weekends to teach myself how to build and then actually build it myself. I did end up looping in a electrician to do the actual electrical work because that can be definitely done wrong and the stakes are kind of high with electrical shock and fires and things like that. And then I had a plumber do the gas lines for me, and then a company do the metal roofing because they had to bend a lot of sheet metal, and I just didn't have the metal brakes for that. But everything else was just basically I would research the next step during the week, and then Thursday night I would write a shopping list. Friday night I would go to Home Depot or Lowe's, pick up the materials I need for the weekend, and then drop them off at my house. And then through Saturday through Sunday, I just like built all weekend, pretty much sun up to sundown for a year and a half.
So, what percentage of the house would you say you built yourself with your own two hands?
I mean, 95% of it.
Okay, so the
Yeah.
the only thing that you had somebody come in to do was electric and plumbing, which are two things that when it comes to a house or I mean, anything really, I those are two things I don't think that I would want to mess with.
Yeah, and I could do some of the basic stuff, but kind of the heavy lifting of, you know, connecting, the power grid into the house or setting up the distribution panel, things like that. It was just something I wasn't comfortable with at the time. Now I know a lot more, but yeah, it's just safer to do it if you don't know.
So you spent the better part of a year on construction, and talk to me a little bit about what it was like to start building this house that you were then going to live in. Like, what did that feel like to know that at the end of this, this was something that not only you were going to have that you built, but this was something that you were going to live in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I loved every minute of it. There were certainly days where I was just like frustrated and tired and annoyed or because things weren't going my way. But it's rare in life that you get to literally build your future in such a like real world tactile way. You're usually building a company or a website or a brand or something like that. These more intangible things. But a house is such a real world item. So it was just really empowering. It felt like I was building my future. And I knew the second that I was able to live in it, it was going to change my life especially from a financial perspective, so drastically. So at the time when I was building it, my basically monthly carrying cost all in was about 1,500 to 1,700 bucks a month. When I got done with the tiny house and moved into it, that dropped down to under 500 bucks. And the house part of it, I spend $6 a month on water and $5 on propane.
And that's, I mean, so now does the propane do like a stove and a refrigerator, or does your refrigerator run off of electric?
Yeah, so uh, basically the propane is for my hot water and my stove, and then electric. Everything else is electric, and that runs off of all my solar panels that I have.
So you don't plug in anywhere.
I mean, I'm connected to city water, but other than that, I'm not even connected to the grid.
Yeah, for yeah, that's what I mean. Like for power, you don't have to plug in for power at all.
Mm-mm. Nope.
Wow. So the solar panels run your fridge. Now, like, is your fridge, is it a full size fridge?
No, it's a mini fridge, but my system could handle a larger fridge just to with a tiny house, everything's, typically smaller.
Right.
So, I have like basically a large bar fridge, and it means I go to the grocery store twice a week, and that's about all I can fit in my little fridge, but it suits me pretty well.
And so you can go to the grocery store twice a week. You can have food in the fridge, and then you can cook, meals for the week.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. So I want to actually step back just a little bit, and you said that pretty soon after the company had closed, you ended up getting hired at another company. And so are you still with that company, or did you end up leaving that company?
I ended up leaving that company. So after that, I went and I decided that I wanted to work for uh, a little bit smaller of a company and also a nonprofit. So I went and got a job at basically a local volunteer organization, helping them kind of recruit new volunteers and agencies, and kind of played matchmaker with them, which was a little bit like what I was doing in my old job, which was recruiting, which was, going out finding companies that need people hired, and I would go find people who were looking for a job or, potentially open to shifting jobs, and I would play matchmaker. So it was a little bit different spin on what I was already doing, but in a nonprofit context. Later on, I went still in a nonprofit, kind of doing a little bit more recruiting kind of stuff. And that was the job that I ended up leaving when my website was kind of producing enough for me to live off of, and I made the leap from your traditional 9 to 5 job to being self-employed.
Now, was that ever in your mind to become self employed and working for yourself? Because from what you were kind of telling me before, it seemed like that you were totally happy working in a 9 to 5 organization and doing those hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing for me was during this process of the tiny houses, I was also looking at the rest of my life. And I basically did a full audit. And I said, obviously you have to work. We all have bills that we have to pay, and that's just part of being an adult. But, you know, how we do that work can be done a little bit differently depending on how you want to go about it. So I kind of set the goal for myself to be a remote worker so that I didn't have to actually be in office at least most of the time. And that was kind of like the goal in the back of my mind. And that first nonprofit job that I had was remote. And then the job that I ended up leaving for my self-employment thing was part-time in the office, part-time remote. So, I was slowly edging that way. And then I realized that, my income from the tinylife.com was exceeding that of what I was making my day job. So that's when I said, okay, like it's time to make the leap. You're making more money over here. You can cover your expenses, and then you can literally do your work anytime, anywhere on your own terms. So that's kind of how that came to be.
Now, my question, and I don't really think I've ever had somebody who was making more in their side hustle than they were at their normal job.
Mm.
They always kind of had this side hustle and had more passion for the side hustle, so they decided to take all their chips and go all in on the side hustle, and that's how they ended up launching their business. But for you, you were kind of making money in both areas. So was it difficult to make the decision to basically cut your income because you were making money at your job, but you were also making money through your website? And so talk to me about that decision to say, like, okay, I am making more money over here, but essentially I still could be, I'm still going to cut my salary to
Mm-hmm.
go over to this, to pursue this more.
Right. Yeah. So it was basically when I was kind of making double income at that point, right? I was working at both jobs, quote unquote jobs, and I was using that extra income to foot the bill of building my tiny house. And it kind of all for me lined up to that. I was about ready to move into my tiny house. Uh, it was like just within the company there was some acquisitioning happen, and it was a good time for me to kind of bow out. And then I had signed my first book deal, and I was launching a new kind of arm of my business, and I knew that was going to take a lot of time. So like my once I got into the tiny house, I knew my expenses were going to drop a lot, and then I also made the decision that you know what is right for me? And the answer was to have employment on my terms, which meant to be location independent, to set my own schedule, uh, not so much to be my own boss, but to control my destiny. That was really important to me. So uh, I said I basically valued that more than the money. And it's easy for me to say that because I could still cover all my bills and then some. So that was a pretty easy thing to just say I'm going to give up the second income. But making the decision still wasn't easy. There was a good bit of fear wrapped up in that decision to make the leap because even though I knew that this narrative was old and defunct and certainly didn't apply to me of go to school, get a job, get married, have kids, uh, it was still so rooted in the culture and in my brain and how I was brought up and raised that it was a scary prospect for me to say, I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to live in my tiny house in the woods and do this website, and no one's going to understand that. For years, I just had to explain to my parents that I was a writer, and to my grandparents, I tell them I work in a newspaper. They don't even understand what a website is or what a blog is. I'm like, Grandma, I just write for a newspaper, and she's like, Oh, okay, I get. Like she understands that, and I've tried to explain it to her that there's a website with a blog and people read it, and they just don't get it. So yeah, I mean that was even though my parents were supportive of it, my mom was very concerned. She just wants what's best for me. And I
Absolutely.
remember when I told them that I had made this decision, she was, she's usually very supportive, but she voiced her concerns at that point. And I listened, but I knew that this was the way I needed to go. So that's when I took the leap.
Well, and that's what moms do. That's what
Right.
moms are
Yeah.
supposed to be here for, and I mean that's their job as moms and dads. They tend to look at the things that you may have overlooked,
Hmm.
and sometimes that's helpful, and other times you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. And like you said, really pursue the things that make you tick and make you, really inspired. So now we're getting into, and we've already gotten into you moving into the tiny house. So how much smaller is your tiny house than where you were living before you moved in?
Yeah. So the apartment that I was in, I had one roommate, and it was about 1,000 square feet, I think was the apartment. And my tiny house now, which I live in alone, is 150 square feet plus a sleeping loft.
Okay, so huge difference.
I mean, yeah, 1,000 square feet for roommates is relatively small uh, for most people. So, but then I went down to even smaller for sure.
Yeah. Now, when it came time and the tiny house was done, I'm assuming that there were some things that did not move into the tiny house with you. So, talk to me about, you know, packing up some of your stuff and leaving other things. Like what got left behind? What was an absolute essential that you knew needed to go with you? Some of those things.
Yeah. So, I mean, at that point, I had sold all my furniture, so I didn't have to deal with any furniture because it just wouldn't come over to the tiny house. And since I was building the tiny house myself, and it took a long time, it took over a year and a half total time, all told. I basically used that time to downsize my things. So my apartment got emptier and emptier, and my closet was emptier and emptier. And then, when I left my traditional job, my wardrobe cut in half because I no longer needed professional dress for, a white collar office environment. So uh, I took a lot of steps in downsizing things, and I can go into like downsizing and minimalism. That's kind of like a really big thing for me. What we talk about over the tiny life is kind of how to do that process and have a more healthy relationship with the things that you do own. But in general, it was a relatively smooth transition. There wasn't a whole lot that I like was difficult for me to part with, or I didn't know what to do with. It all, kind of fit what I needed. And I designed the house for me, which is something that most people don't ever get to experience. They move into an apartment, they buy a home. Most cases, they were built, not for them. They were built for someone else and they purchased them or they rented them or whatever the case is. But when I built my tiny house, I was able to say, okay, what's really important to me? What do I actually need this house to do for me? And then I built everything around that list. So it was very intentional. So by the time that I came in, literally everything had a place, which was a really nice experience.
So now inside the tiny house, you said you sold all your furniture. So aside from your bed, what kind of furniture do you have in the tiny house? Do you have like a table where you can sit down and eat? Do you have a TV that you can watch? I know that you are working remotely, so I'm assuming that you have to have some kind of internet connection. What's going on there?
Yeah. So I most of the stuff that I have in the tiny house is built in, just because you can save a lot of space that way. So I basically the only furniture I have is a mattress, which I'm not sure you can qualify as furniture, but it is a mattress that's up in my sleeping loft, and then uh, a single chair, and then I have a picnic table outside that sometimes I eat meals at, and for TV I have a projector that goes on a screen that pulls down, it's kind of hidden, so you pull it down and you sit in the chair and you watch it. And then I have a few like a folding table that I can pull out if I need to entertain people or have a bigger dinner or something like that. But most of the time, I'm hanging out in my chair, or I'm going out to dinner with friends, or it's nice enough. I live in North Carolina. It's pretty comfortable most of the year. So I have dinner outside, things like that. So yeah, a lot of it was just built-in kind of furniture for me.
And I guess I should have asked this in the beginning, but I just thought of it now. So what part of North Carolina are you in?
I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay, yeah, I've been down to Greenville, North Carolina,
Yep.
multiple times, and I absolutely love it down there. I mean, the weather. I've gone down in November, and the weather is very mild. You could absolutely eat outside. I think even when I was down there, we ate outside.
Hmm.
And then in the summers, it definitely gets a little hot down there. So
Yeah, it
I'm
does.
assuming that you have some kind of air conditioning inside as well.
Yeah, so I have full heating and cooling, and that actually runs all off of my solar panels. So about 80% of my solar panel array is pretty much there just for heating and cooling, because that's the largest energy sink of my entire system. If I didn't have that, I could run off just a few panels and a few batteries, but instead I have a 4,000 watt solar panel array with about 1,200 pounds of lead acid batteries. So it's all the modern comfort conveniences of home just in a small package.
Yeah, I would have to imagine that you don't necessarily need a central air system. You could probably get by with something a little bit smaller than that, huh?
Right, yeah.
So I just I am absolutely fascinated by this, and one of the reasons is because my girlfriend and I, we have this goal, not to be in a tiny house, but we really want to do a Sprinter van conversion.
Oh yeah.
And so this, that was one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on, selfishly, because I wanted to like pick your brain about some of this stuff. But I come from a camping, air quotes camping.
Sure.
My parents have a 35-foot trailer that has a fireplace and talk about all the comforts of home. It has all the comforts of home in there. But we have a goal to be able to do this. So this whole thing is very fascinating to me. But what I found when I'm trying to look things up and kind of just do some research is there's for the Sprinter van conversion, there's actually a lot of information out there. Like there's way more information than what I would need, and it's very hard for me to pick through some of the things that I'm trying to figure out. So I'm assuming that you started your website and your blog because you wanted to put information out there to people who were interested in doing some of these things that you have done. And is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, I mean, when I started, I had to figure it out from scratch 100%. There was no guides, there was no websites, there was no books or manuals or classes or events that you could go to learn about this. So, I started writing about it on my blog kind of as my journey, right? It was just cataloging my journey, and it gained a lot of traction because it was one of the few places that you could actually find that information. And even today, of the larger tiny house blogs, I'm the only blogger that actually lives in a tiny house. The other people just are fascinated by it. So I was always able to, get people interested in what I was doing and writing because I had such hands-on real world experience with it. Um, and then I rolled out my first product, which was an ebook, and I didn't think anyone was going to buy it. And I even like had it sitting on the proverbial shelf for like 6 months because I was so nervous about rolling out a product and charging for something. And it was like $15. Like it was ridiculous that I would be nervous about charging $15 for anything. And then I went to an event and someone was like, I wish there was a book about building codes for tiny houses, and like 10 other people chimed in. I was like, I got a book. And they're like, you do? And I was like, yeah. I was like, it's $15. Interested? And they're like, yeah. And I sold like 10 copies that weekend to these people, and at that point I didn't even have like the website set up. I just emailed them the file and they gave me cash. And then I went home and set up on the website, and that was the product that launched me to leave my job. So, yeah, that's kind of how the website really took off, and providing that value for people.
Now, what about like, are you getting any AdSense or any ad deals on the blog? Is there any income coming from there, or is it just the, I guess, quote unquote, physical products that you're selling through the website that are generating income for you?
Yeah, so I have let's see, 6 ebooks. Two of them are print, and then I have 2 traditionally printed books that you can buy at like Barnes and Noble, Amazon, wherever. And then I've done events, and then about, I would say 50% of my income is from ad revenue. I don't use AdSense anymore because I have a network that gives me higher rates, but I definitely started out with AdSense. So
And so that's generating your revenue there. And you had mentioned it earlier. You kind of just mentioned it again, but you said that you had gotten a book deal. So
mhm.
tell me a little bit about your book deal. What are your books about, and how did that all come about?
Yeah, so basically I was approached by a publisher, which was a nice place to be, right? Most people write a book and then they try to sell it to a publisher through an agent, and it's hard to get an agent, and it's hard to even get a publishing deal. So I was super fortunate in the fact that they found me and approached me, and that put me in a really good position. And you know, it was because I had about 1,000 posts at the time of content that I'd written for people around tiny houses, and they decided that they wanted a book in the tiny house space. So we struck a deal, and it was called or it is called Tiny House Living. And you know, the money was pretty, you know, decent for what it was. The contract I was able to get, and I mainly attribute that to the fact that they approached me, not the other way around. And then uh, for me, the big thing that I did the book for was I wanted, like, on my bucket list was to walk into Barnes and Noble and see my book on the shelf. That was like the thing that I wanted to do. And that deal allowed me to do exactly that. So my book was offered in pretty much every single Barnes and Noble in the US. It was offered in a lot of independent bookstores as well, and then also some places internationally. So, you know, that was the kind of the first book deal, and the second one was kind of a spin-off about recycled materials for building tiny houses, and that was the same publisher. You know, the first book did really, really well, and they kind of want to capitalize in it. So at that point, I did that book, which was a fun project, and then I decided that I was going to basically go self-publish because the profit margins are just so much better. And I was kind of I had built the skill set of like how to write a book, how to produce a book, how to do layout, graphics, you know, printing, shipping, fulfillment, and all that kind of stuff. So from that point on, I went the self-published route, and now I have two books self-published on my own.
And do you use Amazon for that, or do you do everything yourself?
So I have a fulfillment company that's just a third party. It's not Amazon, and I don't use Amazon mainly because they just take such a large percentage. So it's fine if you don't have an audience. You know, you're basically giving them the percentage because they have an audience. But whereas I have my own audience, I'm able to launch and sell to that audience, and thus there's no point in me really giving Amazon a cut. So I handle everything but the actual printing, picking, and shipping of it. That's all automated through the website and this third party company.
Yeah, because I ordered a book from somebody who I have been following on Facebook, and when the book got here, I read through the whole thing. It's just a relatively short book, and when I flipped it over onto the back, it says, I don't remember what it says, something about Amazon in Middletown, Delaware, which is like
Yeah.
35 minutes from where I live. And I'm like, wait a minute, this guy lives in Utah. Why does my book say Amazon of Middletown? So then I kind of started doing some research, and I found out that you can basically submit your book to Amazon,
hmm
and when somebody goes onto Amazon and orders it, Amazon basically, it's print on demand. So they order it, and Amazon, of course, the giant that Amazon is, they have the technology to print the book, bind it all together, box it, and still somehow get it to you in 2 days.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, that's what I do with this other company. It's just they're smaller, and like I said, I'm not paying the premium for the Amazon thing. But yeah, fulfillment by Amazon, and then they bought, I think it's called Lulu, and then Create Space are two companies that they acquired for that print on demand. And then you know Amazon is just a logistics, warehousing, and shipping beast when it comes to that kind of stuff. So you can do literally anything. You rent a cubic square foot. I think it's like $6 a month from them if you want, and then you can be fulfilled by Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon is just an absolute juggernaut when it comes to software and shipping of packages. It just blows my mind how they have the capabilities to do some of the things that they absolutely I mean, just no one else can touch some of the things that they're doing. Now, I gotta ask, what is one of the things, or you can give me a couple, that you miss the most about living in a quote unquote normal house?
Right. So I think right now I don't have a good place for guests to stay over, and I kind of have like a way that I can you know still have people over, but I don't have like a traditional guest room, and I think that would be nice. And the big hang up with guests too is they've definitely never used a composting toilet. So some people are totally into it and they don't care. Other people are just like not about that. So I think a guest bedroom is one thing that I would like to have. And then the other thing is a through the whole process of building my tiny house, I kind of discovered that I really love woodworking, and that was just a hobby that I wanted to pursue more. And woodworking takes up a lot of space just because you need space to manipulate the materials. Like a table saw, you need 8, 10 feet on one side of a table saw and 8, 10 feet the other side. And I'm just not able to really do that at the level that I want to. So I've been in the process actually. I purchased some land in the mountains of North Carolina, and I'm going to be putting a shop up there. And one of the things too is I say that the tiny house isn't necessarily my forever house. It could be, but it isn't necessarily. It could very much be a stepping stone to it. So what the tiny house afforded me was to leave my job to start this tiny life company. I later went on to start a co-working space, and grew that business to the point where I ended up getting a couple offers on it and I sold it. So I would have never been able to do that, and then the the money from the sale of that was able to let me purchase that land, and now I'll be building a shop here, hopefully in the next year or so. So I think those are the two things: is guest bedroom and a wood shop.
So you're not hosting Thanksgiving dinner at the tiny
No,
house, is what you're telling me.
no. I mean, I'll do like outdoor parties when it's a nice weekend and stuff, because one of the nice things about the tiny house is since I can move it wherever I wanted to, basically I was able to strike a deal, and there was this piece of land of a friend, and he was going to build his retirement home there, and he ended up not doing that. His wife wanted to kind of stay where they were at, but he wanted someone to kind of keep an eye on it. So I was able to kind of barter with him, and I help him out kind of on the side with a little like website stuff and other things like that. In exchange, basically, I get to stay on the land is free, and it's 32 acres, and it's in the city of Charlotte. The thing's worth like $2 million, and I'm able to live on that land, which is such a gift because to have that kind of acreage in one of the largest cities in the U.S. is really unheard of. So yeah, it's been a nice thing for me.
Now, what about possessions? Like, are there any possessions that you had to get rid of because you just don't have the space, that you do still really really miss? Because I'm sure there were things that you were going through. It's just like when you clean your room out at your parents' house, and you're like, oh no, I don't want to get rid of that, but I don't have the space. And then 2 months down the road, you never even think of it again. But are there any possessions that you really, really miss that you just cannot have because of the space?
Not really. I mean, the thing when you get tied up with material possessions and things, and our hesitancy to donate them, to give them away, whatever, throw them away, it's usually tied up in emotions, in memories, which are essentially emotions, in sunk costs, right? Like I spent $20 on this thing, you know, I don't want to throw it away. It seemed like such a waste. So yeah, it kind of boils down to emotions and money, and you could probably make an argument that the money is just emotions, wrapped up in a financial kind of form. But I kind of over the years have just gotten to the point where I realize that if there's something that I'm super attached to, I just have to process that and get in a good place with it. And there's certainly things that I still keep, especially sentimental items, things like that, and just your everyday like necessities. But it hasn't been too difficult. It hasn't. There's nothing that I've like tossed that I was like, man, I wish I had that. There's been a few things that I may have donated or gave it away, and then I needed it, so I had to kind of figure out like, okay, well, I guess it's $5 on Amazon. I'll just buy it and then I'll give it away again if I don't have a large need for it or something like that. So there's very few things that you can't replace pretty quickly for cheap. We're talking about Amazon. I can get certain things here in Charlotte delivered to my house in 1 hour if I need to. And the slow boat is basically a 2 day with Prime. So I can buy anything, have it almost instantly. If I really need to, I can go out to the store. I can go to the library to borrow a book. I can, I build relationships so I can go uh, ask to borrow those things if I really need to. But over the years, I've just gotten in this place with material possessions that is, it just works for me really well. And you kind of have that experience of like, oh, I thought I would miss this thing, but 6 months later, you don't even think about it. So, yeah, I think it's just extracting yourself out of that culture a little bit, and then it kind of gives you some perspective.
So you talked about getting a delivery from Amazon. What does your UPS man or your pizza delivery guy say when they pull up and they see your tiny house?
Yeah, so I keep my house kind of on low key. So I have a PO box for anything that needs to get delivered, and I don't order takeout food at all. I cook all from scratch from fresh or go out for dinner. So I guess I've had like the air conditioning repair guy come out, and most of the time they just have lots of questions while they're fixing my air conditioner or something like that. Uh, it's usually a pretty positive experience. They're kind of hesitant at first, but usually it's replaced with curiosity pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's probably just like me. They're probably just like, just question after question after question. So, I guess I mean I although I asked a million questions, I feel like I think I got to everything that I really wanted to learn. About the tiny house. Is there anything that I missed out on that you definitely wanted to add in regards to making this significant change, one of which being living in something that's almost 800 square feet less than where you were.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say maybe two things, and I guess they're kind of related. Is you know take the time, and this is just kind of general advice to people, is like take the time and just ask yourself, what do you want out of life? What is right for me? What kind of life do I want to build and work towards? What are my goals? And just kind of build in some time for yourself to have some intentionality with your life trajectory. And if that's living in a 3,000 square foot home with, a Miata in the garage that's red and kids and all that kind of stuff in a traditional job, if that's the right path for you, then I encourage you to live it. If it's something else, I encourage you to kind of pursue that goal. And that kind of gets me to what I think a lot of people get caught up with is they ask so many questions about the tiny house itself, like how many square feet, what about this, what about internet, do you have air conditioning, toilets, and all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, it's not about the house. It's about the life that I want to build. And the tiny house is just a tool that I leverage for that goal. And so the moment that a tiny house doesn't meet the needs that I have, then I move on. And it's been an immensely, positive impact to my life from a financial perspective, from allowing me to leave my job, allowing me to travel the world for months at a time and write books and launch extra businesses and then, get on this podcast with you. All these types of things probably wouldn't be possible. In many cases, they wouldn't be at all possible if I didn't use this tool that was a tiny house. And a tiny house may not be right for most people. In fact, I don't think it is. I think tiny houses are kind of a fringe type of idea. But I think what's more important, and maybe the larger impact of tiny houses, will be that it allows people to start questioning their own lives and realize that the path that maybe was laid out for them through their parents or society, whatever the thing is, that isn't the only path, that you have options and you need to figure out what's right for you. And there's nothing more empowering than choosing your own path that's true to you. So I think that's the only thing I would add to kind of our conversation tonight would be those two things.
And I think that's a great place to end it, because that was phenomenally said. And so I just want to take this last minute here to say thank you so much for jumping on with me. I really, really enjoyed learning not only about your tiny house, because I did ask some of those similar questions that you were just talking about, like where do you go to the bathroom and stuff like that. But, I got a glimpse into really the why of what made you come to this decision. And, I think it's very interesting and it's very empowering to hear from someone that, you are using this as a tool to gain the life that you want to live. And I think that is the definition of doing it for yourself. So whether you're using a tiny house to live the life that you want to live, or you're using triathlon to live the life that you want to live, or just as you said, you're building a company that has multi-million dollars worth of sales and you can live in a 5,000 square foot house with whatever car you want, you're doing it for yourself. So thank you so much for coming on, Ryan, and being so open. And I really can't wait to share this interview with my followers and with your followers as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, I would love to catch up with you again when you either make the addition to the current tiny house and you have a guest room, or when you launch this woodworking shop that you have, and we can kind of explore that new avenue that you're going down and this new business that you're starting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's been something that I've been working towards for a long time. Owning land was just something I wanted from a young child, honestly, and that has been able to be realized at this point. So now the question is, okay, what next? And that's been fun to, try to figure out and ideate around about that next step for me.
Yeah. All right, Ryan. Well, I will let you get going. I've taken more than enough of your time this evening, but again, thank you so much. And I hope to, talk with you soon.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right, my friends. There you have it. My interview with Ryan Mitchell. What did you think? How did that hit you? Just think for a minute about all the things that you would have to sacrifice when moving from an 800 and some square foot apartment into a 125 square foot tiny house. I'm not so sure that I would be able to do the composting toilet, I believe is what Ryan called it. And as a triathlete, and I said this to Ryan on the podcast, I don't know that a tiny house would even be able to house all of the things that I need just to complete a triathlon. But I have much respect for Ryan and everything that he's doing. I think it's really cool that he started this blog and this website to become a resource for people that end up hopefully not in the same position as him, but they end up in a position where they want to learn more about tiny houses and start building their own tiny house and start their own dream. So I really enjoyed this interview with Ryan. I hope that you enjoyed it as well. And I really look forward to seeing you again next week.